the war should have ended before it even truly began. For the Vrike Dominion, a species that had dominated the stars for nearly 5,000 years, war was nothing more than an exercise in efficiency. Their fleets, each the size of small moons, had shattered civilizations with ease. Their technology outmatched most species by centuries. Their empire stretched across hundreds of systems, encompassing countless conquered races, each one assimilated, enslaved, or erased. When humanity was discovered in a remote arm of the galaxy, the Vrike barely considered them worth a formal declaration of war. The humans' fleets were primitive, their colonies scattered and vulnerable. Intelligence reports described them as adaptable but fragile, prone to infighting, and lacking the technological foundation to resist an interstellar war. The Dominions, warlords expected a swift and total victory. At first, that expectation seemed correct. The first human colonies fell within months. Orbital defenses crumbled under the Vrike's relentless bombardments. The humans fought fiercely, but their ships were outmatched. Their weapons were effective but inefficient, requiring overwhelming numbers to compensate for a technological gap that should have sealed their fate from the start. Yet, despite the initial victories, something was wrong. The first sign: a hollow prize. When the Vrike occupied the first human worlds, they expected the usual spoils: prisoners for interrogation, infrastructure for repurposing, industrial complexes that could be turned toward the Dominion's own war machine. Instead, they found only ashes and echoes. Cities were abandoned, eerily silent. The air, once breathable, had been corrupted by tailored bioweapons, ensuring no Vrike could settle without extreme measures. The land was pockmarked with deliberate destruction. Farms razed, power grids collapsed, water supplies poisoned. And it wasn't just carelessness. The destruction was meticulously planned, executed with surgical precision to leave behind nothing of value. Vrike commanders were baffled. This was not desperation. It was something else, something deliberate. The enemy that wasn't there, as the war progressed, human forces became harder and harder to pin down. Where other species would stand their ground and fight to the last soldier, humans vanished. They would abandon key systems without warning, retreating deep into uncharted space. The Vrike would seize yet another planet, yet another shipyard, only to realize too late that it had been turned into a trap. Entire garrisons were wiped out overnight by rigged infrastructures, reactors overloaded on delay timers, atmospheric processors suddenly reversing their outputs, automated defense systems activating days after the Vrike believed they were secured. The strangest reports came from ships patrolling occupied systems. Vrike warships detected human distress calls, pleas for help, military transmissions, the sounds of battles fought just beyond their sensors. But when they investigated, there was nothing. Sometimes, sensor ghosts appeared, massive human fleets that, upon closer inspection, simply weren't there. Yet the more the Vrike investigated, the more they suffered. Ships lured into false battles were ambushed by real human forces lying in wait. Massive Dominion convoys transporting resources from occupied human worlds vanished into the void without a single distress signal. Fleets stationed on newly conquered planets would report strange disturbances, shadowy figures spotted on security feeds, empty ships drifting in from the void, entire barracks of soldiers disappearing overnight. Fear began to creep into the Dominion's ranks. The humans had become ghosts. The scorched echo begins, then came the broadcasts. They started as whispers, faint signals on unoccupied channels, impossible to pinpoint. At first, they were dismissed as background radiation, old signals bouncing through the void. But the messages grew louder, clearer. You have not won. You have only taken the corpses we left behind. Every world the Dominion conquered began receiving these transmissions. Every fleet in occupied space was bombarded with recordings of battles that had never happened. Human generals issuing orders from ships that no longer existed. Colonies declaring resistance long after their destruction. Distress calls from vessels that had been confirmed destroyed weeks earlier. The Vrike, for all their technological superiority, could not explain it. Their analysts scrambled to decode the signals, searching for the source, but there was none. The broadcast came from everywhere and nowhere, and the fear set in. A war that never ends. Entire Vrike fleets were forced to remain in occupied systems, not to defend against an active resistance, but against the possibility of one. When a Dominion colony ship attempted to settle a former human world, the settlers began experiencing hallucinations. At first they believed it was psychological warfare, until those who heard the voices began to die. One by one, they turned, up dead in their quarters, their own weapons used against them. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, just silent, bloodless deaths. The Vrak warlords demanded answers. Their generals offered none. Their soldiers feared to speak of what they had seen, what they had heard, in the darkness of those dead human worlds. And then, the final horror emerged. Vrek fleets stationed above the ruins of Earth itself, the ultimate prize of the Dominion's conquest, began experiencing system failures. Ships powered down inexplicably. Internal sensors detected movement where none should exist. Some soldiers claimed they saw figures moving within the wreckage of old human stations, shadows with eyes that burned like dying stars. When the fleet finally received an emergency transmission from their own flagship, they assumed it was another human trick. It wasn't. The message was from the admiral of the fleet, screaming, begging, before the signal cut into static. The ship was still there, hanging silently in orbit, unresponsive. When a boarding party was sent, they found no one. Every soldier, every officer, every technician, gone. Weapons were left behind. The ship's reactor was fully operational, but not a single soul remained. The Vrake Dominion, the most powerful empire in the known galaxy, finally realized the truth. Humanity did not fight wars the way others did. They did not seek territory. They did not seek conquest. They did not even seek victory in the way the Vrake understood it. Instead, they made war something eternal. Something that never truly ended. Even in death, they ensured they would never be forgotten. Even in retreat, they ensured their enemies would never know peace. The Vrake had not conquered humanity. They had only become infected by them. And for the first time in 5,000 years, the Dominion felt something it had never known before. Terror. The Vrak Dominion had learned to fear the darkness between the stars. Despite their vast technological advantage, despite their overwhelming numbers, they had come to realize a horrifying truth. The humans did not fight like any other species. They did not hold their ground in grand, decisive battles. They did not march in formation, announcing their strength with massive fleets. Instead, they disappeared. And then, when the Dominion least expected it, they returned. The Phantom War, the first reports of the so-called ghost fleets were dismissed as errors, sensor malfunctions, or the ramblings of Vrake officers suffering from war fatigue. Fleets stationed in occupied human space began detecting phantom signals, entire formations of enemy warships appearing on long-range scans, only to vanish when visual confirmation was attempted. At first, the Dominion believed it was simply human misinformation warfare, a clever but ultimately powerless trick. But as the reports grew more frequent, the paranoia set in. There were Vrake warships that swore they had engaged human forces in battle, trading fire, maneuvering in elaborate formations, outflanking and outgunning their enemies, only to later realize that their wreckage reports did not match reality. The debris of fallen human ships was nowhere to be found. The battle recordings, when analyzed, showed no enemy ships at all, only the Vrake firing at empty space. Admirals accused their own officers of incompetence. Some captains were executed for supposed failures in judgment. But then it happened, again and again. Entire Dominion fleets scrambled to respond to sudden mass incursions, tens, sometimes hundreds of human ships appearing in coordinated formations. The Vrake mobilized quickly, shifting vast amounts of resources, only to find nothing, no ships, no battles, no war at all, just silence. The strain on the Dominion's forces became unbearable. Fleet formations broke down, supply lines collapsed as convoys were diverted to nowhere, responding to false alarms again and again. And then, at the peak of their exhaustion, the real human fleets attacked. When the Vrake were at their most vulnerable, spread thin across occupied space, desperately chasing shadows, human warships emerged from their hidden strongholds and tore through the Dominion's weakened forces like a blade through soft flesh, a ghost that kills. But there was something worse than the psychological terror of fighting an enemy that was never truly there. The ghost fleets were real. The humans had discovered an unnerving truth about warfare in space. An enemy that believes it is fighting ghosts will eventually become blind to the real threat. The Dominion had grown so accustomed to false signals and phantom battles that when the humans actually arrived, the Vrike no longer trusted their own sensors. When a Vrike fleet detected an incoming formation of human ships, their officers hesitated. Was it another illusion? Another trick of war? Their commanders delayed action, waiting for confirmation. By the time they realized it was real, it was too late. Entire squadrons were annihilated before they even opened fire. Some fleets, overwhelmed by paranoia, fired at everything, shooting at sensor echoes, at their own ships, at empty space, until their ammunition was depleted and their defenses were scattered. Then the real attack came. The ghost fleets had achieved something no military force in the galaxy had ever done before. They had turned an empire's own senses against itself. The dead ships. But it was not just deception. The humans had perfected something even more horrifying. They understood that war was not just about who fired the most shots. It was about who controlled the battlefield, who dictated the enemy's thoughts. And so, they filled the stars with dead ships. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of abandoned warships, cargo freighters, and civilian vessels, each one stripped of life, but not of purpose. They drifted through, occupied space like graves in the void. To the Vrike, they were indistinguishable from real threats. Some were rigged with dormant weapons, activated only when scanned too closely. Some contained bioweapons, released when Dominion forces foolishly attempted to salvage them. Others broadcasted distress signals, looping endlessly, luring curious crews to their doom. But the worst were the ones that contained nothing at all. Empty, dark husks, floating without destination, without a crew, without a single trace of life. And, yet, some of them still moved. Varrock patrols reported sightings of derelict human ships adjusting their orbits, seemingly of their own accord. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving within their hollow corridors. Others swore they heard whispers on the comms, soft, broken voices speaking in languages long forgotten, calling out for help. The Dominion soon forbade all contact with abandoned human vessels, but it didn't matter. By then, the damage had been done. A war that never ends. The ghost fleets were not just a tactic, they were a message. Humanity had mastered the art of making war eternal. The Vrike had taken human space, but they had not conquered it. They had not crushed the humans, because the humans had never fought to win. They fought to haunt, to fill the void with echoes of battles that had never happened, to ensure that long after the last human fleet had vanished, the Dominion would still fear them, to make war something that never truly ended, because no Vrike commander would ever again trust that the silence meant they were alone. And in the cold darkness of space, even the most powerful empire in the galaxy had begun to understand the one truth humanity had known all along. The dead are never truly gone, and we are always watching. The Vryak Dominion's war machine had never encountered a foe like humanity. For millennia, the Dominion had crushed civilizations with overwhelming firepower, reducing enemy morale to dust through sheer brutality. Their strategy had always been the same: break the enemy's spirit, subjugate their survivors, and integrate the remnants into their empire. But humanity did not break. They did not surrender. They did not plead. They simply disappeared. And, when they returned, they did not fight for territory, nor for victory in the conventional sense. Instead, they fought for the mind. What followed was not just a war of weapons, it was a war of sanity. The seeds of doubt. The first signs were small, subtle, almost imperceptible. It began with whispers on communication channels. Faint, broken, transmissions layered under normal fleet operations. At first, Dominion technicians believed them to be glitches, the echoes of old human distress calls still bouncing through the void. Then, the whispers changed. They began calling out by name. Officers, pilots, engineers, not common names but specific individuals. Admiral Varesh, you were there when Vrith fell. You left them to die. Subcommander Ralkesh, do you still hear them screaming? The Dominion's commanders, creatures of logic and discipline, dismissed the transmissions as human psychological warfare. Yet, the voices persisted. Even when ships moved to entirely different sectors, officers kept hearing their names whispered through static. And then the dreams began. Vrake soldiers stationed in occupied human systems started suffering from shared nightmares. Entire crews would wake up screaming, recalling the same visions. Dark corridors filled with unseen movement, human figures staring at them from beyond broken hulls, the sensation of unseen hands pressing against their armor, clawing at their skin. Medical reports detailed a rising wave of stress-related psychosis. Officers with decades of combat experience were breaking down, refusing to sleep, refusing to enter certain sectors of their own ships. More disturbingly, Vrake battle records showed a spike in suicides. No pattern could be discerned. Rank, experience, duty station, none of it seemed to matter. High-ranking admirals, low-ranking engineers, even seasoned warlords, all found in their quarters, their own weapons in hand, their final logs filled with unreadable symbols and desperate, rambling warnings. The collapse of order, the Dominion, tried to counteract the psychological attacks with standard protocol, executions for those who hesitated in battle, loyalty conditioning for those who wavered. But it didn't work, because the humans were patient. They did not launch direct assaults. They did not need to. They only needed to whisper. Entire fleets fell into paranoia-induced chaos. Captains refused to leave their quarters, convinced that something unseen was watching them. Security teams turned on each other after claiming to hear footsteps in empty hallways. During one particularly infamous event, a Vrike battleship, the Tyrant's Whale, received what appeared to be an old human distress call. It was traced to a derelict human station orbiting a dead world, an installation that had been abandoned for over 50 years. The admiral of the ship, against protocol, decided to investigate. The moment the boarding team entered, the station activated. Lights flickered to life. Atmosphere restored itself. Human voices echoed through the halls, welcoming the intruders. Then the team's vitals flatlined simultaneously. The last message from the ship was garbled, filled with screaming. When a second team was sent to investigate, they found the ship completely abandoned. Not a single body remained. But in the admiral's quarters, the walls were covered in deep, jagged carvings. A single sentence repeated over and over. "I let them in." The weaponization of fear. This was the true strategy behind the psychological collapse doctrine. The humans had realized that no empire, no matter how strong, could function when its own commanders lost faith in reality. Instead of focusing on direct, military engagement, humanity had turned the Dominion's own minds into the battlefield. They created patterns where none should exist, filling occupied systems with unexplainable events, entire Dominion warships going missing, later found drifting. Light years away from their last known location, their crews erased. Vrek intelligence reports being altered, showing contradictory data that no one remembered submitting. Fleet transmissions slightly out of sync, with messages sometimes being received before they were even sent. Officers receiving handwritten notes in their own language, left in their private quarters, written in their own handwriting. The Dominion's greatest weakness had never been its firepower, nor its numbers. It had been its unwavering belief in control. The humans shattered that belief. They turned order into chaos, certainty into doubt, discipline into madness. And the worst part? The Vrak never truly knew whether the humans were actually doing it, or if the fear itself had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The breaking point. The psychological collapse doctrine reached its peak when the Vrak High Command itself fell, victim to it. A critical war council was held in the Dominion's central stronghold, an impenetrable fortress world far beyond the reach of the human remnants. It was a closed communication event, meaning no outside signals were allowed in or out, and yet, a human transmission played during the meeting. The warlords watched in stunned silence as their own recorded battle reports were rewritten in real time. The holotable displayed new data, new outcomes, entire fleets erased from existence, Dominion victories altered to crushing defeats, battle plans rewritten before their eyes. And then, a final message. This is not deception. This is not sabotage. This is what you have already done to yourselves. In that moment, the warlords realized the truth. The war was already lost, not because they had been defeated in battle, not because their fleets had been destroyed, but because they no longer trusted their own reality. The Vrike Dominion had become A fractured empire, an empire that feared its own shadow, an empire that saw enemies in every reflection. And in that paranoia, in that suffocating doubt, the humans had ensured that even if they were wiped from existence, they would never truly be gone, because fear itself had become the greatest weapon, and the Dominion would never know peace again. The Vrak Dominion was a war machine built on conquest. For thousands of cycles, their fleets had rolled across the stars, consuming entire civilizations. Every species they encountered was either assimilated or exterminated, their resources stripped, their worlds reshaped into industrial hubs that fueled the Dominion's endless expansion. The Vrak did not just win wars, they devoured their enemies. And yet, in their attempt to subjugate humanity, they had failed to recognize one simple truth. You cannot starve a species that has already learned to survive in hell. The Vrak's grand strategy. The Dominion had initially assumed that the war against humanity would be swift and decisive. Their fleets bombarded Earth's colonies into submission, obliterated orbital infrastructure, and severed vital trade routes. Then, they executed the Starvation Protocol. It was a strategy that had broken dozens of civilizations before. Blockade every remaining human system, cut off food production, seize energy reserves, destroy supply lines. No species had ever withstood it. Without resources, resistance would crumble. Within a few years, at most, a starving, desperate humanity would come begging for mercy, willing to sell their own survival for servitude. But as the years dragged on, something wasn't right. The human colonies should have been in ruin. Their fleets should have been dead in space, their people reduced to feral scavengers. Yet every time the Dominion launched a reconnaissance mission, they found something impossible. Humanity was not just surviving, they were thriving. The art of endurance, humanity, had not responded to the starvation tactics like other species. There were no mass surrenders, no widespread collapses. Instead, they adapted in ways the Vrak had never imagined. Where the Dominion expected panic, humanity became ruthless in their efficiency. They cannibalized their own infrastructure, repurposing anything and everything. Civilian ships were stripped and rebuilt into hydroponic farms. Ruined cities were turned into subterranean refuges. They stretched every resource beyond its limits. A single protein ration, meant to last one soldier a week, was diluted, extracted, and remanufactured into food supplies that lasted months. They recycled everything. Water, air, biomass, nothing was wasted. The Vrak had cut them off, but humanity had become self-sustaining. They engineered synthetic food sources. Entire agricultural stations had been wiped out, yet humans somehow continued to produce nutrients from algae farms, lab-grown proteins, and chemical synthesis. But it was not just survival. Humanity had turned starvation into a weapon. The gambit begins. The first true sign that something was wrong came when the Vrak attempted to capture a remote human colony. The invasion was expected to be a simple operation, overwhelming force, complete control, total surrender. But when the Vrak landed, they found a dead city, not a destroyed city, not a battlefield, just empty. Food stores had been deliberately poisoned, water supplies laced with lethal toxins. The power grid had been overloaded to collapse. The remaining humans? Gone. It was as if the colony had never been meant to survive. But then, the Vrak troops stationed there began to die. Slowly, without battle, without warning. At first, it was malnutrition. The same starvation they had expected, humanity to suffer. The Vrak had relied on repurposing enemy infrastructure to sustain their forward operations. But there was nothing left to take. Then came the sicknesses. Artificial plagues. The humans had engineered starvation itself into a biological weapon. The food left behind had been modified. Perfectly edible for humans, but completely inedible for the Vrak. The air filtration systems introduced subtle enzymatic disruptors, rendering Dominion digestive systems incapable of processing standard nutrients. And then, the sabotage. Every attempt to establish a stable outpost failed. Power systems failed. Fuel stores degraded. Water supplies turned acidic. The Vrak soon realized the horrifying truth. The humans had not been trying to hold their colonies. They had turned them into traps, turning starvation into a blade as more systems fell into human hands. The Dominion's war machine began to grind to a halt. The humans had adopted a brutal strategy. If they could not have a world, neither could the Dominion. Every retreating human force left behind a wasteland. Entire planets were rigged to self-destruct. Oceans poisoned, atmospheres thickened with lethal pollutants, orbital shipyards burned down to twisted wreckage. And the Dominion, now dependent on these captured systems for their own supplies, began to starve instead. Logistics collapsed. Fleets, meant to be self-sustaining through conquest, found themselves stranded. Troops suffered mass casualties, not from battle, but from malnutrition, dehydration, and disease. The hunters had become the hunted. The final blow, a feast of ashes. The breaking point came when the Dominion launched a desperate counteroffensive, throwing their remaining fleet at what they believed to be humanity's last stronghold, a hidden agricultural world. They expected to find vast fields of crops, deep storage of rations, self-sustaining biospheres. They found nothing, no farms, no food, only ruins. As the Vrake fleet settled into orbit, the humans sent them a final message, one that would forever be burned into the Dominion's history. You wanted to starve us, but we were already starving long before you came. You wanted to cut us off from our home, but we carry home with us wherever we go. You wanted to break us with hunger, but we are hunger itself. The humans had no central supply lines, no dependencies. They had become something the Dominion had never imagined, a species that could not be conquered. In the end, it was the Vrake who starved. Their once mighty fleets were left derelict in the void, unable to sustain themselves. Their war effort collapsed, not through battle, but through a slow, agonizing death, one that humanity had endured and survived, because humans had spent their entire existence fighting hunger, fighting scarcity, fighting extinction. They had already mastered the art of survival, and in the depths of their suffering, they had learned the most terrifying lesson of all. To win, you only need to outlast your enemy. The Vrek Dominion had reached its breaking point. Their war machine had ground to a halt. Their fleets, once the unchallenged masters of the stars, drifted as skeletal remains in the void, victims of humanity's unrelenting warfare. Their armies, decimated by starvation, psychological collapse, and impossible battles, no longer advanced. They only clung desperately to what little they had left. And then, the humans did something that defied all logic. They disappeared. The vanishing of an enemy, one by one, human-controlled systems went silent. Vrake scouts sent to investigate found only ruins, abandoned cities, derelict stations, empty warships left adrift in the darkness. Entire human colonies, teeming with millions of refugees and soldiers just weeks before, were simply gone. It was not a surrender. It was not a retreat. It was as if humanity had chosen to erase itself. At first, the Dominion believed this was yet another deception. Perhaps it was a final gambit, an illusion designed to lure the Vrake into a false sense of security before striking again. But as time passed, the truth became unavoidable. Humanity, the enemy that had defied every expectation, had vanished from the galaxy. The paranoia of an empty battlefield. At first, the Dominion celebrated. They declared victory over the human scourge, broadcasting their triumph across what remained of their empire. But the celebration was short-lived, because nothing filled the void that humanity had left behind. The war-torn planets that should have been easy to reclaim remained empty and lifeless. The supply lines that should have been rebuilt remained broken and inaccessible. The psychological scars left behind by humanity's terror tactics refused to fade. The Dominion had won the war, but there was nothing left to rule. And then, the whispers returned. They had begun during the psychological collapse doctrine, the eerie transmissions that had shattered the Dominion's confidence. But these new whispers were different. They were not meant to terrify. They were meant to remind. Across the Dominion's most secure channels, on encrypted frequencies that no enemy should have access to, the messages began. We are not gone. You did not win. You cannot kill what does not exist. High-ranking warlords, once proud conquerors, began to break under the weight of paranoia. Was humanity truly extinct, or were they waiting in the shadows, watching, preparing? The Dominion's leadership, already fractured from years of unrelenting war, began to turn on itself. Some believed humanity had merely hidden, preparing for a final war. Others suspected a deeper horror, that humanity had become something else entirely, that they had found a way to transcend death itself. The ghosts of a dead species. As the years passed, incidents became more frequent. Dominion patrol ships disappeared, without a trace. No wreckage, no distress signals, just empty space where entire fleets had once been. Freight colonies suffered strange anomalies. Shadows moving where no light should cast them. Figures glimpsed in the reflections of observation. Glass, reports of distant, distorted voices calling out in languages that no Vrake spoke. But the true breaking point came when the Dominion received a transmission from Earth. The planet had been left to burn, a husk of its former self, its surface glassed and uninhabitable. No living thing should have been able to transmit from its surface. And yet, the message arrived: look upon your victory. The Dominion's warlords watched in stunned silence as orbital scans of Earth changed before their eyes. The world, once thought to be a dead rock, showed signs of regeneration. The radiation levels that should have made the surface uninhabitable had begun to diminish at unnatural speeds. The planet's atmosphere, stripped away by orbital bombardment, was returning. Worst of all, biosigns were detected. Not Vrake, not remnants of Earth's old ecosystem, something new. The Dominion's best scientists, the greatest minds of their empire, attempted to make sense of the impossible data. Theories were proposed and dismissed, and then the final message arrived. You wanted to exterminate us. You wanted to erase us. But what is dead can evolve without limits. You have not destroyed humanity. You have set us free, the terror of the unknown. The Dominion never received another human transmission after that day. The whispers faded. The disappearances slowed, but the fear never left, because the Vrake now faced a truth far worse than war. They had no idea what humanity had become. Had they abandoned physical form? Had they left the galaxy entirely? Had they rewritten themselves into something beyond mortal comprehension? They did not know, and that was the true horror. The Vrake had won the war, and yet they had never felt less victorious. Because every darkened corridor, every unexplored world, every shadowed nebula could be hiding them, not as soldiers, not as a species, but as something greater, something immortal, something that could return at any time. And so, for centuries to come, the Dominion would live in fear, not of an enemy they could fight, but of an enemy that might no longer exist. As they understood it, the war was over, but humanity had won. The war had shattered the Vrake Dominion. Their fleets were decimated, their armies hollowed by famine, paranoia, and psychological warfare. The whispers of humanity's disappearance still echoed in their encrypted channels, and the galaxy stood in uneasy silence. But the greatest horror was yet to come, because humanity had left behind something else, a final testament to their ingenuity, their madness, their will to win at any cost, an impossible weapon. The discovery, it was the Vrake world of Shanthur that first sounded the alarm, a core system, heavily industrialized, strategically vital, and one of the few stable strongholds the Dominion had left. For over a decade, the Dominion had fought to rebuild after the war. Humanity's disappearance had left a void, but the Vrake were determined to survive. They reclaimed abandoned shipyards, restarted production lines, and began refortifying their borders. Then, on the eve of their resurgence, it happened. The stars shifted. At first, the Vrake thought it was a sensor malfunction, some anomaly in the gravitational field. But the readings didn't lie. The entire planet was moving, not by any natural force, not by any technology the Vrake possessed. Something was pulling Shanthur. The horror in the void. The Dominion scrambled to respond. Massive fleet deployments were ordered, planetary defenses activated. But no enemy appeared. No human fleet emerged from the darkness. Then, deep space beacons detected it. A structure. Vast. Impossible. A weapon beyond comprehension. At first it was mistaken for an asteroid, a rogue moon. But as sensors analyzed its composition, the truth became undeniable. This was not a natural object. This was designed. A construct, hundreds of kilometers wide, a ring-like array positioned at the system's edge. Its function was unclear. No energy signatures, no known weapon configurations. And yet, Shanthor continued to move. Not randomly, not chaotically. It was being reeled in, as if some invisible force had lassoed an entire planet and begun dragging it toward the construct. Panic erupted across the Dominion's command structure. Orders were shouted, escape plans devised. But there was nowhere to run, because when the Vrike finally deciphered the transmissions encoded in the construct's faint electromagnetic pulses, they found a single message. A message that made no threats, no demands. It was not a warning. It was simply a fact. We built this for you. The mechanics of the unthinkable. No known species had ever attempted planetary manipulation on this scale. The energy required to move a celestial body should have been beyond the limits of physics. And yet, the humans had done it. Not with brute force, not with massive thrusters or artificial gravity wells. They had used something far more elegant. Something was subtle. The construct, now identified as the tether, was not a conventional weapon. It did not fire beams of plasma or launch kinetic rounds. It simply tugged, a force barely perceptible, fractions of a fraction of gravity, but it never stopped. It never lost momentum. The Dominion's top scientists realized the horror too late. The tether had been active for decades, possibly since the final years of the war. And now, Shanthor was accelerating. The unstoppable consequence. The Vrike attempted everything. They launched countermeasures, deployed warships to fire upon the construct, but nothing worked. The tether had no weak points. It was not a station, not a facility, not something they could attack, because it wasn't doing anything in a conventional sense. It had simply been placed in exactly the right position, with exactly the right mass, to influence Shanthor's orbit over decades, a tiny, imperceptible shift in gravity, that had accumulated into a force powerful enough to drag an entire world to its doom. And now, nothing could stop it. Within months, Shanthor's climate destabilized. The planet's molten core reacted violently to the increased strain, triggering massive tectonic upheavals. Within a year, the planet's orbit decayed irreversibly, and then, the final horror became clear. Shanthor was not being pulled into the tether. It was being flung, launched on a trajectory toward the Dominion's remaining strongholds. The ultimate warhead, the realization sent shockwaves of panic through the Vrek Dominion. Shanthor, a world teeming with billions, an industrial titan, was now a weaponized planet. Humanity had not disappeared. They had set traps across the stars. This was one of many. Over the following years, other Vrike systems reported the same anomalies. Planets shifting by impossibly small degrees. Their orbits, just slightly different than they should have been, all leading to one horrifying conclusion. Humanity had turned entire worlds into missiles, and the Vrike had no way to stop them. Because unlike conventional weapons, these had no launch sequence, no countdown. They had already been fired, decades ago. Now they simply followed the laws of physics to their inevitable, unstoppable conclusion. A war that humanity no longer needed to fight, because it had already been won. The Dominion collapsed. Before the First World even made impact, their empire, already weakened, dissolved under sheer existential terror. Warlords turned on each other, scrambling to evacuate planets that could no longer be saved, and the galaxy watched in horror as entire worlds, each one nudged ever so slightly, became harbingers of annihilation. The final message the tether construct never deactivated. It remained there, silent, watching. And as the last remnants of the Vrike fled into the void, a final transmission echoed across the Dominion's encrypted channels. A voice, calm, almost gentle. You thought we needed ships. You thought we needed soldiers. But war is not won by battles. War is won by time. A pause. Then the last words the Dominion would ever hear from humanity. enjoy the gravity. And then, the Vrike were gone. Because humans had never needed to fire the last shot. They had let the universe itself do it for them. The Vrike dominion was no more. Its warlords, once feared throughout the galaxy, were either dead, in hiding, or clinging to dying fleets drifting through lawless space. Their homeworlds were shattered, their remaining colonies abandoned to chaos. Entire planets had been turned against them, their own worlds hurled like missiles across the stars. And yet the galaxy still trembled. Because humanity had not reappeared. There were no triumphant parades, no declarations of victory. No conquerors emerged to claim dominion over the ruins of the Vrake. Humanity had won the war, but they had not returned. And that was what terrified the remaining galactic civilizations the most. Because without their presence, without their voice, a single chilling question remained. Had humanity abandoned the galaxy? Or had they become something worse? The silent aftermath, the fall of the Vrike dominion left a power vacuum unlike anything in recorded history. Other species, once crushed beneath the Vrike war machine, hesitated to take their place, because everyone had seen what happened to those who opposed humanity. The shattered moons, the planets turned into slow-moving weapons. The tether, still, watching from deep space, patiently pulling at unseen threads. The universe remembered. The Vor Coalition, the second most powerful empire in the galaxy, had been on the verge of war with humanity before the Vrike invasion. Now their fleets stood down, their warships remaining docked for the first time in centuries. The Cenari Republic, a species known for their opportunistic expansion, stopped colonizing human-claimed space. They treated abandoned human worlds like sacred graves, never setting foot upon them. Because no one knew if humanity was still watching, and no one dared to find out. The Forbidden Worlds, there were places in the galaxy that no species, no scavenger, no explorer dared approach. Earth, still regenerating, its once glassed surface showing signs of life no one could explain. Mars, where orbital stations remained abandoned, silent, yet still functioning. The void-wrapped colonies of Proxima Centauri and Titan, where ships that ventured too close would suffer strange malfunctions, navigation systems failing, comms filled with eerie echoes of voices that should not exist. Most chilling of all was the Rift, the sector of space where hundreds of human ships had once vanished in the final years of the war. No wreckage was ever found. No distress signals were ever sent. Just silence. Until one day, a Vor research vessel strayed too close. What they saw was impossible. A structure, vast beyond measure. Larger than any station, any ship, any artificial construct in history. It was not built for habitation. It was not built for war. It was a transition point. A construct meant for only one purpose: departure. The Vor scientists barely escaped with their minds intact, their ship returning with corrupted data and garbled logs. But in the last intact recording, one phrase was translated from an unknown signal. We have gone beyond. The last war that never came as. The centuries passed, speculation grew. Some believed humanity had evolved beyond physical existence, transcending into something else. Something that no longer needed planets or ships. Others feared they were waiting, that one day without warning they would return. No threats, no ultimatums, no war fleets. Just a silent, calculated end to whatever stood in their way. And so, the galaxy did the only thing it could. It waited. Wars between other species stopped before they could begin. Empires that might have once sought conquest chose diplomacy instead. The memory of humanity was not a legend, it was a warning. Because somewhere, in the darkness between stars, in the places no ship dared venture, the tether still drifted, and when its weak electromagnetic pulses were analyzed, when its silent signals were deciphered, one final message was discovered. A message not directed at the Vrike, not at the Vor, not at any species in particular, a message for the entire galaxy. The last war never needed to be fought. We gave you a choice. Choose wisely.